There's a version of this story I've heard more times than I can count. Someone sends me a message, usually a DM or sometimes an email, and they say something like, I finally left. I don't know why I stayed so long. I feel like I've wasted years. And I always want to ask, what took so long? Not as a judgment, as a genuine question. Because here's what I've learned after coaching executives and leaders through some of the most difficult transitions of their careers. The leaving is rarely the hard part. The hard part is what happens before the leaving. The slow erosion, the daily accommodations, the stories you tell yourself about why you are still there. That's what we're talking about today. The emotional cost of staying too long. Welcome to Live Without an Expiration Date. I'm Rich Jones. This show is about the part of your career that nobody puts on a LinkedIn post, the transitions that don't have clean narratives, the decisions that took longer than they should have, the reinventions that nobody planned. If you've been listening for a while, you know I don't do pep talks. What I do is talk to you the way I'd talk to a senior leader sitting across from me in a coaching session. Honestly, directly, and without pretending the hard parts aren't hard. Today's episode is one of those. We're going to talk about what staying too long actually does to you, not the career implications. The industry knows that story. We're going to talk about what it does inside you, to your sense of self, to your judgment, to your capacity to lead. And we're going to talk about why sweet, smart, capable, experienced people who should know better, stay anyway. Let's get into it. I want to start with a distinction that I think gets lost in most career conversations. There's a difference between staying through difficulty and staying past your time. Staying through difficulty is leadership. It's what you signed up for. Hard seasons, organizational change, a board that's driving you crazy, a strategy that's messy in execution. Those are parts of the job. You don't run from those, you lead through them. Staying past your time is something different. It's when the conditions that made the role meaningful are gone, that you're still there. It's when you've stopped growing, when the work has become maintenance rather than mission, when you look around and realize the organization needs something you're no longer motivated to give. That's the hard thing to say out loud. And most people don't say it out loud, not even to themselves. But let me push further, because staying too long isn't about tenure. It's not just about years in the seat. It's about the moment where usually there's a specific moment when you knew, when something shifted and you understood on some level that this chapter was ending. And instead of acting on that, you filed it away. You talked yourself out of it. You decided it wasn't the right time. I've had leaders tell me the moment was when the board chair said something in a meeting that revealed a fundamental misalignment in values. I've had others tell me it was a reorganization that left them reporting to someone they didn't respect. I've had others tell me it was quieter than that, a Sunday night feeling that started showing up every week, a creeping dread, a low-grade exhaustion that sleep didn't fix. Here's the question I want you to sit with as we go through this episode. When was your moment? You probably know. It might be in your current role. It might be something from your past. But most experienced leaders, if they're honest, can point to it. The question isn't whether you had the moment. The question is what you did with it. And for most of us, what we did was wait. Why we stay? So why do we stay? I want to go through the real reasons, not the sanitized ones, not the ones that show up in exit interviews. The first reason is identity fusion. For a lot of executives and senior leaders, the job isn't just what you do, it's who you are. Your title is how you introduce yourself. Your organization is how you explain your relevance. Your work is where your sense of competence lies. So when you start to sense that it might be time to leave, what you're actually facing isn't a job change, it's a self concept crisis. What are you without the role? Who are you without the role? That question is terrifying to a lot of people, and terror is a powerful motivator. Not to act, but not but to not act, to stay silent, to tell yourself it's not that bad. I've watched highly capable leaders shrink their professional lives, take less meaningful work, accept diminished roles, endure disrespect rather than confront that question because the alternative felt like free fall. The second reason is what I call sunk cost story. You know what sunk cost is. It's a cost you've already incurred that can't be recovered. Standard economics says you should ignore sunk cost in decision making because they're already gone regardless of what you choose next. But human psychology doesn't work that way. When you've invested 5, 10, 15 years in an organization, when you've built something, when you've sacrificed for something, when your reputation is tied to something, leaving feels like admitting that investment was wrong. But most high achievers are not built for that kind of narrative. So the story becomes, I can't leave now, not after everything I put into this, or things are going to turn around, or I need to just give it more time. The sunk cost story is seductive because it sounds like loyalty. It sounds like persistence. From the outside, it looks like commitment. But from the inside, it's often just fear. Fear of admitting that the chapter is over. Fear of starting over. Fear of what the departure will mean about you. The third reason is external validation dependency. Here's one that doesn't get talked about enough, especially in conversations about senior leaders. A lot of us, not all, but a lot, have built our sense of worth on feedback loops that exist only inside the organization. The staff that respects us, the board that trusts us, the community that recognizes us, the culture we built. When those external signals are present, they feel like evidence that we're doing something right, that we matter, that our work has value. And over time, those signals become a substitute for internal validation, for knowing your own worth independently of what the organization reflects back at you. So leaving isn't just about losing a job, it's about losing the mirror. And that's much harder to walk away from. The fourth reason is the responsibility trap. This one is particularly common in mission driven organizations, credit unions, nonprofits, healthcare, education, anywhere you choose specifically because the work matters. The trap sounds like this: I can't leave because of the people who depend on this work. Or I can't leave because of what I built. Or I can't leave because no one else will do this the right way. And I want to be careful here because that concern is real. The mission is real. The people are real. But I've sat across from enough leaders to tell you what that story often becomes over time. It becomes a justification for staying in a situation that is no longer healthy for you, or increasingly, no longer healthy for the organization you're trying to protect. Because Here's the uncomfortable truth about the responsibility trap. When you're staying out of obligation rather than genuine commitment, people can feel it. Your direct reports can feel it. Your board can feel it. The organization can feel it. The leader who stays past their time out of duty rather than drive rarely serves the mission the way they think they do. The fifth reason is one people tell me the least, the one I think is the most common. It's a fear of the open space, not fear of failure, not fear of judgment, fear of the quiet. Because when you leave, when you actually step away from the role that has organized your life, you have to face yourself. You have to figure out what you actually want, not what the organization needs, not what the board expects, but what your title says you're supposed to do, what you want. And for people who have spent 20 or 30 years building careers in service to something larger than themselves, that question is surprisingly hard to answer. The open space is uncomfortable, and staying, even in a situation that costs you, at least gives you the structure to avoid it. Let's talk about what the actual cost is to you, because this is where the most career conversations stop. They talk about the decision to leave, the timing, the transition mechanics. They talk about the emotional cost as a background factor, sometimes to manage something to address the exit process. I think that's backwards. The emotional cost isn't a footnote, it's the main event, and it accumulates over time in ways that are hard to see while you're in the middle of it. The first cost is the erosion of your professional identity. Here's what I mean. When you stay in a role that no longer fits, when you're operating against the grain of who you actually are and what you actually believe, you start to make accommodations. Small ones at first. You don't push back on that decision the way you normally would. Or you let something go that you would have fought for 3 years ago. Or you soften your perspective in a meeting because the battle isn't worth it anymore. Each individual accommodation is rationalized. It's strategic, it's reading the room, or it's picking your battles. But over time, those accommodations add up. And what they added up to is a gradual, almost invisible rewriting of who you are as a leader. I've had leaders tell me after leaving a role they stayed in too long that they didn't recognize themselves in their last 2 years, that they'd become someone more cautious, more political, more protective than they ever wanted to be. That's not a character flaw. That's adaptation. It's what human beings do to survive environments that are no longer aligned with who you are. But it costs you, and it takes real work, sometimes years of work, to recover the version of yourself you left behind. The second cost is what happens to your judgment. Leadership requires clarity. It requires the ability to see a situation clearly, to read what's actually happening, not what you want to happen, not what you fear is happening. Extended stays in a misaligned role corrodes that clarity. Here's why. When you're in a situation when you have a significant emotional investment in a specific outcome, when you need things to turn around, when you need the organization to validate your decision to stay, you start to see evidence selectively. You overweight the positive signs, you underweight the warning signs. You reframe the problems as temporary rather than structural. And the longer you're in it, the worse it gets, because now you have years of investment in a story that things are going to improve. I've watched otherwise exceptional leaders make terrible decisions in the final stages of a bad fit, decisions about strategy, about people, about their own conduct, because their judgment was compromised by how much they needed things to be okay. The person you could have called that situation accurately from the outside is the same person who couldn't see it clearly from the inside. That's what prolonged misalignment does to your judgment. It doesn't break it at all at once. It breaks it slowly over time. The third cost is physical. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because it isn't a wellness show, but I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't say it plainly. Chronic stress has a physical address. It lives in your body. The sleep that gets worse, the weight that changes, the tension that becomes your resting state, the health appointments you've been putting off because you don't have bandwidth. These aren't separate from the career conversation, they're part of it. The body keeps score, and leaders who stay too long in high stress, misaligned roles almost always pay a physical price, one they often don't fully understand until after they leave and the baseline shifts. The fourth cost, and this one I want to spend the most time on, it's what it does to your relationships. Let's do inside the organization first. One of the defining characteristics of a leader who has stayed too long is what I call the narrowing of the circle. You become less accessible, more guarded. You start to trust fewer people, not because the people changed, but because you needed to protect more. Your internal landscape is crowded with things you can't say, concerns you can't surface, frustrations you can't express. And that guardedness radiates outward. Your direct reports can feel it. Your leadership team can sense it. The culture doesn't get your best leadership, it gets your managed leadership. But it's the relationships outside the organization that I think pay the steepest price. Partners, spouses, close friends, and family. These are the people who see you when you're not performing, who live with the version of you that the organization never sees. And when you're staying too long, what they live with is the residue. The distraction at dinner, the short fuse on a Saturday morning, the inability to be present because you're always carrying something, the slow, quiet withdrawal from the life that exists outside your professional identity. I've had leaders tell me with real grief that they look back at years of important family time and realized they weren't really there. Their bodies were there, their attention was somewhere else. That's a cost you can't recover. You can't go back and be present for the years you spent managing a situation that was already over. The fifth cost is the opportunity cost. And I mean that in the deepest sense, not just the career sense. When you're in the wrong place, you are not in the right place. That sounds obvious, but sit with it for a moment. Every day you stay in a role that no longer serves you is a day you are not building towards the next thing. You're not developing the ways the next chapter will require. You're not making the connections, taking the risks, building the capabilities that are work you are actually meant to do, that you actually are meant to do will need. You're maintaining, and maintenance is not growth. And for leaders in the second half of their career, and that's a significant part of who this show is for, that opportunity cost carries real weight because the calendar matters more now. There is less time to recover from years spent in the wrong place. I'm not saying this is to create urgency or urgent for urgency's sake. I'm saying it because I think second half career leaders are often the least likely to name this cost honestly. They've been conditioned to be patient, to be strategic, to not make impulsive moves. And those are good instincts in the right context. But patience in the wrong situation isn't wisdom, it's delay, and delay has a price. Let's talk about the stories we tell. I want to talk about the narrative layer of this because I think the stories we tell ourselves about staying are some of the most sophisticated and convincing work we do. Leaders are, almost by definition, good at framing. They're good at finding the story that makes sense of a situation. It's part of what makes us effective. And that skill doesn't turn off when we're rationalizing our own situations. The most common story is the turnaround narrative. Things are about to change, or a new board member is coming in, or a strategic plan is getting underway, or we just need to get through this quarter. And sometimes it's true. Sometimes the turnaround is real. Sometimes the commitment to stay through difficulty is exactly right. But here's how I've learned to distinguish the legitimate turnaround from the rationalization. Ask yourself how many times you've told yourself the same story. If this is the third or fourth version of things are about to change, if you can look back and see a pattern of near improvements that somehow never fully arrive, you're probably not in a turnaround story. You're in a hope loop. And hope loops are costly, not because hope is wrong, but because they occupy the cognitive and emotional space that clarify what otherwise, the space that clarity would otherwise live in. The second story is the uniqueness narrative. No one else knows this organization like I do, or no one else has the relationships I have, or if I leave, it falls apart. I want to be careful here because sometimes this is genuinely true. Your institutional knowledge matters. Your relationships are real. The timing of a departure can have real consequences. But I've also heard this story from leaders whose organizations were already falling apart, whose continued presence was, in fact, a contributing factor to the dysfunction, who generally believed they were the only thing holding it together. The uniqueness narrative is particularly seductive for people with strong mission orientation. It wraps the decision to stay in the language of sacrifice and service, which makes it very hard to examine honestly. A good question to ask yourself: would a truly excellent version of you, at full strength, fully committed, in full alignment with this organization, make a different choice than the one you're currently making? If the answer is yes, the uniqueness narrative might be covering something else. The third story is the timing story. It's not the right time. The organization is in the middle of something, or I can't disrupt things now, or I'll give it one more year. The timing story is almost always available. There's almost never a perfect time to leave. Organizations are almost always in the middle of something. What this timing story often really means is I'm not ready to face what comes next, and the organization gives me a legitimate reason to delay. That's okay to admit. Readiness is real. The discomfort of transition is real. But naming it honestly, this is about my readiness, not about the organization's timing, is more useful than the alternative because once you name it accurately, you can actually work with it. You can ask, what would I need in order to be ready? Or what am I afraid of? Or what does the next chapter look like if I stop wasting stopped waiting for the perfect moment. The timing story, as long as it's a story, prevents those questions from being asked. The fourth story is the performance story. I need to show them what I can do, or I need one more win, or I need to prove this was worth it. This one I have particular sympathy for because I've lived it. The performance story turns into a matter of pride. It reframes the situation as a challenge to overcome rather than a chapter to be ended. And for high achievers, for people whose identity is built around solving difficult problems, it's a powerful hit hook. The problem is that it inverts the logic. You don't owe the organization proof that you were good, that you were a good hire. You don't need to earn the right to leave by producing one more extraordinary result. But more importantly, and this is the harder thing to hear, the performance story often leads to the worst work of your career because you're not doing it from a place of genuine commitment or authentic drive. You're doing it to manage a narrative, and people can feel the difference. The best work I've seen leaders do, the clearest and most impactful, most honest work, comes from a place of alignment, not from a place of proving something. Let's talk about what recovery actually looks like. And I want to spend some time here because I think this is part of the conversation that is underserved. Most career content is about the decision to leave the mechanics of transition, the next opportunity, not about the recovery from the extended stay in the wrong place. But recovery is real, and it takes longer than most people expect. The first thing that happens when you leave is relief. Not immediately, always. For some people, the first weeks are disorienting. They almost universally, at some point in the early aftermath of leaving a role you stayed in too long, there's a wave of relief that tells you something true. That wave is important information. Let yourself feel it. Don't rush past it to figure out what's next. The relief is your nervous system recalibrating. It's the baseline shifting. And until you have a sense of what the new baseline actually feels like, you're not in a good position to make clear decisions about what comes next. The second thing is grief. This one surprises people. You think that leaving a bad situation would produce only relief, but grief is always almost part of it. Grief for the years spent, grief for the version of things you hoped would come to pass that didn't, grief for relationships that were bound to the organization and may not survive the departure, grief for the identity you're leaving behind, even when that identity was costing you. Let the grief be there. Don't short circuit it by moving too fast to the next chapter. Unprocessed grief from one chapter tends to travel to the next one, and it doesn't announce itself clearly. It shows up reactively. Cynicism, difficulty trusting, reluctance to fully commit. The third thing, and this is the recovery work that I think matters most, is the work of reconstructing your self-concept outside of the role. Who are you when you're not the CEO, when you're not that executive, when you're not defined by the organization? This is not a quick question. It's not resolved in a weekend retreat or a good conversation with a coach, though both of those help. It's work that happens over time through doing, through taking on projects that reconnect you to what you actually value, through rediscovering what it feels like to operate from strength rather than obligation. through paying attention to what energizes you, not what the market rewards, not what looks good on paper, what actually gives you energy. The fourth piece of recovery is recalibrating your judgment. If you've been in a situation where your judgment was compromised, where you were seeing things through a lens of your own need for the situation to work, you need to rebuild your capacity for clear-eyed assessment. This means seeking honest input from people who will tell you the truth, not the version of the truth that protects you. It means sitting with ambiguous situations longer than you're comfortable with, rather than defaulting to the interpretation that feels safest. It means being willing to be wrong about your own narrative. Some of the best work I've seen leaders do in this phase is honest post-mortem work, not for the purpose of self-flagellation. That's not useful, but for the purpose of understanding. Where did my judgment bend? What were the early signals I discounted? What stories was I telling myself in retrospect were protecting me from a clearer view? That kind of clarity is hard to develop. And while you're still hard to develop, especially while you're still in the situation, but it's incredibly valuable once you have distance. The fifth piece is recovery time. This is the one people resist the most, especially leaders in the second half of their careers who feel urgency about not wasting any more time. The leaders I've seen rebuild most effectively, who go on to do some of their best work in the chapters after a prolonged, difficult stay, are the ones who gave themselves enough space to recover before launching into the next thing. Not years, usually not more than several months of genuine recovery time, but actual recovery time, not just the 2 weeks between jobs where you're already interviewing, already performing readiness, already in pursuit mode. Time where you let yourself not know what comes next, where you give your system a chance to reset. I know that's hard to do, especially if you have financial obligations or you're driven by the urgency to prove you're still relevant. Those pressures are real. But I'd ask you to consider, what would it cost you to take the recovery time seriously? And what has it cost you not to? Let's talk about what it means on how you lead. I want to bring this forward because for a lot of people listening, this isn't a retrospective conversation. It's a present tense one. You might be in the situation right now, feeling what I've described, telling some of the stories I've named. So let me be direct with you. If you're in a role right now where your moment has already happened, where you've already had the internal recognition that this chapter is ending, the question isn't whether to leave. The question is, how long are you going to let the cost accumulate before you act? That's not me pushing you out the door. There are real, legitimate considerations in timing of a departure. I'm not dismissing those, but I want you to be honest about what's actually driving the delay. Is it legitimately strategic timing, or is it one of the stories I described earlier? If you can look at that question honestly, you're already doing better work than most people in your position. If you're in recovery, if you've recently left a role you've stayed in too long, I want you to hear this. The disorientation you feel is real. The grief is real. The loss of identity is real. And none of it means you made the wrong decision. Some of the most capable leaders I've ever worked with have been in exactly this place. The confusion doesn't indicate weakness. It indicates that you were deeply invested in something that mattered to you. That is not a flaw. That's evidence of who you are. The work now is, is to use this period well, not to rush through it, but to use it. If you're in a role that still fits, if you're reading this not from the inside of the problem, but from the outside, let me leave you with this. Pay attention to your moment when it comes. Not that you can act on it immediately, not that you can run from difficulty, but so that when the signal comes, you don't file it away. The moment you know the beginning of the data, not the deadline. You don't have to act on it that day, but you need to hear it. You need to let it be in the room with you rather than locking it out. Because the cost of not hearing it, the cost of staying past your time is real. It's not abstract. It lives in your body, in your relationships, in the slow erosion of the person you've spent your career becoming. You are too experienced, too capable, and too close to your best work to pay that cost unnecessarily. I want to close with something personal. My career has not been a straight line. You spent, if you've spent any time with this show, you know that I've navigated transitions that didn't have clean narratives. I've had chapters that went on longer than they probably should have. I've told myself some of the stories I described today, and I've paid some of the cost I described today. I'm not telling you this from a place of having figured it all out. I'm telling this from a place of having lived through enough of it to know what it actually costs and what becomes possible on the other side. The title of this show is Live Without an Expiration Date. And what I mean by that is not that careers don't end or that chapters don't end. They do, and they should. What I mean by that is your capacity, your ability to lead, to contribute, to do meaningful work doesn't expire. It doesn't have a timestamp on it. It survives the organizations you work for. It survives the roles that define you for a season. It survives the transitions that feel in the middle of them like free fall. But you have to protect it. And protecting it is something, protecting it is sometimes means having the courage to leave before it costs you more than you can afford. That's what staying too long is about. Not just a career decision, a decision about who you're going to be. And you get to make that decision. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this episode landed for you, if it named something you've been carrying, I'd love to hear from you. You know where to find me. And if there's someone in your life who needs to hear this conversation, send it to them. The best thing this show can do is to get in the hands of people who need it. Take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.